The day Emmeline walked into the glass-walled conference room, on the 14th floor, she had already rehearsed what she would say if she ever saw him again. 8 years of rehearsing, and the moment arrived without warning. Fletcher Drummond stood at the head of the table in a gray suit, pointing at the quarterly projections on the screen behind him. He looked older than she remembered, sharper somehow, like someone had taken the softness out of his face and left only certainty in its place. She stopped in the doorway. Her hands went cold. Every prepared word she had ever imagined saying to him dissolved immediately. He glanced toward the door. His eyes passed over her face the way a person's gaze passes over furniture, without recognition, without warmth, without anything at all. "Close the door on your way in," he said, and looked back at the screen. That was it. 8 years, and that was all she got. Emmeline sat at the far end of the table and stared at the report in front of her without reading a single word. Her colleague leaned over and whispered, "You okay? You look pale." She nodded and kept her eyes on the paper. She was not okay, but she had learned a long time ago how to look like she was. Growing up, Emmeline had understood early that life did not arrange itself fairly. Her father left when she was 6. She did not have a dramatic memory of it. No shouting, no slammed doors. One morning he was there, and by afternoon he was not, and her mom, Donna, simply stood in the kitchen for a very long time looking at nothing before she started washing the dishes again. Emmeline watched from the hallway. She understood, in the way children understand things before they have language for them, that from now on, she would need to be quieter and less trouble than she had been before. They moved in with her grandparents in Memphis shortly after. Her grandmother, who everyone called Gran, had a way of filling a room without being loud. The smell of cornbread. In the evening, the sound of the television turned low, the specific way she tucked Emmeline's hair behind her ear without being asked. Her grandfather, Henry, was a retired firefighter with big hands and a careful laugh. He told her once that being brave was mostly just deciding to keep going, even when you didn't want to. She carried that idea with her for years before she understood what he meant. Her mom worked double shifts at the hospital, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. She came home tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Emmeline learned to have dinner waiting, to run the laundry, to stay out of the way when Donna needed quiet. She did not resent any of it. She simply adapted, the way water adapts to the shape of whatever it fills. Her grandfather had 6 small rental rooms built along the back of the property when Emmeline was 10. He kept the rent low because, as he said, he remembered what it felt like to be 20 years old and far from home with very little money. Most of his tenants were college students from out of state. Gran took an interest in each of them the way she took an interest in everything, steadily, without judgment, with small plates of food left at their doors. Emmeline was 13 when the last room on the end was rented to a 21-year-old from Cincinnati named Fletcher. She noticed him because he was the only tenant who swept the walkway without being asked. She mentioned this to Gran, who smiled and said nothing. For the first month, she barely spoke to him. He kept unusual hours, up early, back late, and ate mostly what he made himself rather than coming to the main house for dinner. Emmeline watched him from a distance, the way she watched most things, quietly and without expectation. She did not realize she was in trouble until the morning she overheard Gran tell Henry that the boy in the back room had been working 2 jobs since arriving because his mother was ill and couldn't help with tuition. Emmeline was in the next room doing homework she had no intention of actually completing. She did not move for a long time after she heard that. That evening, Gran sent her to the back rooms with a plate of food. She knocked on Fletcher's door and he opened it with a book in his hand and the particular expression of someone who had not been expecting company. She held out the plate. He looked at it, then at her. "Gran said you look like you skipped dinner," Emmeline said. He looked at her another moment before accepting it. "Thank her for me." "You can thank her yourself," Emmeline said. "She's right there in the kitchen." He almost smiled. That was the beginning. Fletcher started helping her with schoolwork 2 months later, after Gran asked him directly. And he accepted because he was the kind of person who could not say no to a direct and genuine request. Emmeline resented this arrangement at first. She was not accustomed to someone paying close attention to her work, and she found it easier to fail quietly than to fail in front of an audience. He was patient with her in the specific way that some people are patient, not indulgent, but steady. He did not pretend that wrong answers were almost right. He waited until she figured things out herself, and when she couldn't, he showed her again from a different angle without making her feel stupid. She called him old man to annoy him when he corrected her, and he ignored this with the same focus he applied to everything else, which annoyed her more. By spring, she was passing every class. She did not realize how much she had come to depend on his presence until he almost told her something important. They were studying at the library table they had claimed as their own. Third row from the left, near the window that faced the parking lot. And he had closed his book and looked at her in a way that was different from how he usually looked at her. She remembered the quality of the afternoon light. She remembered not knowing what to do with her hands. "Emmeline," he said, and then his phone rang. His face changed completely when he looked at it. He answered and stood up in one motion and walked away from the table. She watched him through the library window from where she sat. He had one hand pressed flat against the glass, and he was very still in a way that frightened her. He came back to the table and started gathering his things. "What happened?" she asked. "My mom," he said. "I have to go." She wanted to ask if he was coming back. She did not ask because she was 13 years old, and she already knew, from watching her own mother, that sometimes people left, and there was no useful question to ask about it. He was gone the next morning. She knew before she even looked at the back room, something about the stillness of that end of the property, the absence of his motorcycle. Gran was making coffee and did not say anything, only touched Emmeline's shoulder once as she passed. There was a note on the table inside the room. Gran let her go in to read it. "Don't stop studying. You're smarter than you think you are. If we're supposed to find each other again, we will." She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket and walked back to the house and did not cry. She had learned to cry later, in private, when no one needed her to be holding herself together. She waited for him to call Gran's number. He never did. 8 years. She studied finance because he had once told her that numbers were one of the only languages that didn't lie to you. She kept the journal he had given her at the end of that first semester, the one with her name pressed into the cover, until the spine finally gave out, and then she kept the pages. She said no to every person who asked her out, without fully understanding why at first, and then with complete and quiet understanding later. When she saw his name on the company directory, on her first day at Aldercroft Financial, she stood in the lobby for 3 full minutes unable to move. She had applied for the analyst position because the job description matched her experience. She had not known whose company it was. That first meeting, when his gaze moved across her face without stopping, she had to remind herself to breathe. She spent the rest of the day at her desk with her head down, processing what it meant that he could look at her and see nothing. She made herself believe that it meant she could let go now. If he didn't remember, then the chapter was closed, and she could finally begin something else. She almost convinced herself. Portia arrived at the office on a Thursday. She walked through the glass doors without pausing at reception, which told Emmeline something immediately. She was beautifully dressed and had the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in whatever room she entered. She stopped near Emmeline's desk and looked around with a kind of impatience that was almost theatrical. "I'm looking for Fletcher," she announced, to no one in particular. Several colleagues exchanged glances. Emmeline kept her eyes on her screen. "Fletcher Drummond," Portia added, as if the full name lent authority. "The director." One of the younger analysts started to point toward the executive hallway, but Emmeline stood up first. "Do you have an appointment?" Portia looked at her for the first time. "Excuse me?" "This floor is restricted to staff and scheduled visitors," Emmeline said evenly. "If you have an appointment, I can let him know you're here. If you don't, you'll need to wait at reception downstairs." The office went very quiet. Portia held Emmeline's gaze for a long moment, then said in a lower voice, "Do you know who I am?" "I'm sure you'll tell me," Emmeline said. She heard someone near the window cover a laugh with a cough. Her closest friend in the office, Bianca, quietly took Emmeline's arm afterward and said she was either the bravest or the most reckless person she had ever met. Emmeline thought it was probably both. She also thought that Portia would not forget this. She was right. Portia returned the following week and stood in the middle of the office and told anyone who would listen that she was Fletcher's intended, that their families had an arrangement, that Emmeline had been behaving inappropriately with him, and that she would not tolerate it. Fletcher's name had been connected to Emmeline's in-office gossip ever since he had stayed late with her twice and brought coffee without being asked, and Portia had clearly heard every word of it. Emmeline sat at her desk and said nothing. Fletcher appeared at the edge of the room before the situation could get worse, and his voice when he spoke to Portia was quiet and completely final. "We are not engaged," he said. "We have never been engaged. What our families discussed is not something I agreed to, and it is not something that will happen. Stop coming here." Portia left. Fletcher looked at Emmeline once briefly before walking back to his office. She looked away first. That night she sat in her apartment and thought about what it would take to stop feeling things for someone who had decided, for whatever reason, not to remember her. The company retreat was at a hotel on the waterfront. 2 nights, meant to be a reward at the end of a difficult quarter. Bianca seemed lighter than usual all evening, more generous with her smiles, more attentive to Emmeline's glass. They had been close for almost a year, eating lunch together most days, texting each other complaints about office policy and everything else. Emmeline trusted her the way she had learned to trust carefully, in small amounts, over time. She finished the drink. Bianca pressed into her hand near the end of the night and thought nothing of it. An hour later, standing in the corridor outside the banquet room, she understood that something was wrong. The heat started behind her ears and spread outward, and the lights seemed very bright, and her legs were not doing what she asked them to. She put one hand on the wall and focused on the exit sign at the end of the hall. A man she did not recognize materialized at her elbow and said something she didn't catch. She pulled away from him and couldn't get her feet to cooperate. She made it 20 feet down the corridor before she stopped, unable to remember which room was hers. Then Fletcher was there. She did not know how he had seen her leave or how he had moved that quickly. She only knew that his hand was on her arm, and he was saying her name in a voice that was not the careful professional voice he used in meetings. It was the voice from the library, from the back room of Gran's house, from early mornings when she was 14 and furious about being awake before sunrise. He got her to his room because it was closest. He kept the lights low and made sure she drank water. He sat in the chair by the window all night, and when she was coherent enough to register his presence, she found him there, still watching, still awake exactly as she would have expected and exactly as she had missed. "You remembered," she said, at some point in the dark. He was quiet for a moment. "I always remembered." She found out about Bianca the next morning, through the security footage Fletcher had already requested. She sat with that knowledge for a long time, before she felt anything other than a dull and enormous sadness. Bianca had wanted Fletcher's attention. She had seen Emmeline as something standing in the way. The plan had been for something much worse to happen in that corridor, and the only reason it hadn't was Fletcher. Rowena, the operations director, handled the termination personally, and without delay, presenting the footage to the entire department before Bianca even arrived that morning. There was no quiet dismissal, no covering it over. Everyone in the office saw exactly what had been done, and to whom. Emmeline did not have to say a word beyond confirming what the footage showed. She asked for a day off and spent it sitting by the waterfront, watching the boats. That evening, Fletcher found her there. He sat beside her, and for a long time neither of them said anything. Then he told her what had actually happened 8 years ago. His mother had collapsed that same evening, a stroke, sudden, no warning. His estranged father had appeared at the hospital like something from a bad dream, offering to pay for the treatment on one condition. Fletcher had to leave immediately and take over the family's business operations back in Cincinnati. He had 48 hours to decide. He had lost the piece of paper with Gran's phone number on it in the chaos of that night. He had tried to remember the last 4 digits and gotten them wrong twice. He had told himself he would find a way back once things were settled, and then settling things had taken years, and by the time he had enough independence to look, he did not know if she would want to be found. "I hired you myself," he said quietly. "When your application came through, I recognized your name in the first second." Emmeline looked at the water. "You let me think you didn't know me." "I was afraid," he said, "that you'd be right to be angry. That I'd waited too long and it would be better for you if I just—" "It wasn't better," she said. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "I know," he said finally. It took them time. Trust is not a switch, and Emmeline had learned over a lifetime to be careful with hers. But Fletcher was patient in the same way he had always been patient, without pressure, without shortcuts, showing up consistently until showing up was simply what he did. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning, he asked her to come with him across town. She recognized the library from 2 blocks away, the same brick building, the same concrete steps. A tree she remembered had grown considerably. The parking lot had new asphalt. She turned to look at him. "Third row from the left," he said. "Near the window that faces the parking lot." She pressed her hand over her mouth. He stopped on the steps and reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small ring that was nothing extravagant and exactly right. He didn't kneel dramatically. He just held it out the way he had always done things, directly, without performance. "I have been trying to get back to you since the night I left," he said. "And I am done with the distance between us, if you'll let me." Gran would have had something to say about this, Emmeline thought. Something warm and precisely right and unhurried. Henry would have laughed and said took long enough and meant it with complete and uncomplicated love. Her mom would hold both of them at once and not say a word. Emmeline looked at the ring, and then at Fletcher, and then at the library steps where a younger version of herself had sat waiting to become something she couldn't yet see. She reached out and took the ring from his hand. Some things take a long time to arrive. That doesn't make them any less exactly what they were always going to be.